Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. Today we're talking about building our digital defenses with the advent of artificial intelligence and other deep tech technologies. And I'm delighted to be joined on my show today for this episode by two formidable leaders at the intersection of tech, cybersecurity, and corporate governance, both of whom sit on the boards of leading financial institutions. First, I have Nkemdili Uwaje-Begho. She's a digital transformation strategist, tech entrepreneur, and CEO of FutureSoft, a Forbes-recognized powerhouse and non-executive director at Stanbic IBTC Holdings PLC. She brings rich insights on emerging tech and innovation across Africa. And of course, I have Mrs. Odunfa, cybersecurity trailblazer and CEO of Digital Jewel. She's a certified information systems auditor, governance expert, and non-executive director at Rand Merchant Bank. She's one of the continent's most respected voices on digital risk, resilience, and IT governance. Great to have you both on the show today. Thank you for joining me. Of course, with the advent of these deep tech technologies and other types of technologies such as artificial intelligence, the risks are also growing. So I guess my first picture is, can you help us kind of lay out the current state of digital transformation and security around the world? You know, where is Nigeria, where is Africa? And I'll start with you first, Mrs. Odunfa.
Right, so I'd like to frame that within the context of some of the global surveys that we see, alongside, 30 years of experience and quite a lot of work on the continent. And what we see is, if you look first at, for example, the Global Digitization Index, we see Nigeria and Africa positioned at a fairly dire state. We see that amongst the top two categories of front runners and adopters, only South Africa is featured. And Nigeria, alongside quite a lot of African countries, are right down at the starter category. And the question may be, why is this? Nigeria is rated very poorly around indices like ubiquitous connectivity and green technology, not surprisingly. Other indexes, for example, the Global Digital Competitiveness Index ranks Nigeria at 125 of 137. The 2024 Network Readiness Index ranks us at 112 of 133. For cybersecurity, I'll just touch on the Global Cybersecurity Index, which is conducted by the ITU and has ranked Nigeria at the third tier, most African countries at the third and the fourth tier, of 5 tiers. However, that's not the whole story.
Of course. Yeah.
That's not the whole story. I think what we find is that a lot of these surveys suffer from inadequate data and inadequate responses from our regions, and also matrices that are a little bit skewed and not in our favor, if I may put it that way. So when we're being ranked against things like green technology, it's not surprising. In reality, my own experience has been, or my own informed view will position Nigeria as an aggressive adopter of IT, especially in recent times in the wake of COVID. We've seen that several sectors, for example, financial services, oil and gas, are very heavy adopters of IT. And clearly with that, they have seen benefits. The cybersecurity side of it lags somewhat behind the adoption of IT. However, those who are heavy adopters understand the importance. Whether they are doing enough on it or not is something else.
Yeah.
Clearly, public sector also lags behind private sector, not just in Nigeria, but in several other African countries.
So that's interesting, Ken, because notwithstanding these rankings, and of course you always have to take rankings with a pinch of salt, because the methodology is there's always a question mark. But given these trends and given the fact that it feels like right now in Nigeria, across organizations and in your own private professional life, we're all adopters of technology, generative AI. It's not like we live in a bubble away from these things. Given that adoption, how can organizations actually balance the need for innovation and better data protection and cybersecurity?
So I think that organizations really just need to make sure that they have the right type of frameworks in place, and frameworks that still enable innovation, right? And I think sometimes, especially in regulated industries, this can be extremely difficult because you have heavy regulation that tells you don't do this, don't do that, and you're unable to truly innovate. And I think that's where we really need to find the balance. We also need to look at risk, obviously. I think that should really be at the forefront of how we look at our technology infrastructure, right? Where we identify risk in a proactive manner and make sure that we're building technology. So from a data perspective, having decentralized data, making sure that your customers are in charge of their own data and how that data is used, and that there's transparency around that, you know, and also making sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, you're really focused on how do you create a zero trust infrastructure, how do you make sure that your cybersecurity is proactive, and how do you actually also use AI, for example, to drive that, right, as opposed to just waiting for an attack to maybe happen
and
to you.
Responding.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you were talking about how we can mainstream these issues. It's interesting because if I may, and if you don't mind, you're both in the tech world, you're both in cybersecurity, and you have positions on boards. So my observation now is that highly regulated industries are now recognizing the importance of having that expertise at that level of governance, which is why you now have more tech experts sitting on boards, more cybersecurity experts, especially for financial institutions. And I'm wondering whether we're seeing a seismic shift in the way leadership at these institutions see the risk from a strategic perspective. Would you agree? Maybe
Yes,
briefly. Yeah.
I think absolutely. I think when it comes to technology risk as a whole, there's much more time on boards being spent. And in financial services, the reason why there are digital directors on the boards is because the CBN has a policy that requires 2 digital directors on every financial services board, right? We're not quite there yet in terms of having 2, but most of the financial or the leading financial service institutions have at least 1 digital director. And when you look at the quality and structure of the technology committees that they have, right, you will see that there's a lot of focus on risk management that concerns technology. And a lot of that, again, is driven by regulation from the central bank. And it's similar in other highly regulated industries as well.
Yeah, and of course, Mrs. Odunfa, you worked not just in Nigeria, but across several African markets. Looking at the leadership and board issue, and obviously we can't ignore the fact that we're in International Women's Month. That's kind of a backdrop. Have you seen enough to retain and attract talent in this field at that level?
So certainly not.
Yeah.
That's the short answer. But there are initiatives. So, for example, because the regulator in Nigeria, as Nkem said, is driving representation at the highest level for directors. So at this point, it's not about gender. It's about who's the right person, who's got the skills that we can steer us in this direction. Across Africa, I feel that apart from perhaps Rwanda, that is clearly leading in terms of gender equality. The other African countries are lagging behind, especially at the very senior levels. And we haven't seen much of a regulator push the way we have in Nigeria, and I think it's commendable, what the CBN has done, and that is helping to ensure that financial institutions who manage a lot of risk are doing so in a more responsive way. I think for a lot of organizations, they know clearly you don't have to encourage them to adopt IT. It is their competitive ability, right? But they need a better understanding of how to stride the management of risk alongside, especially when it comes to digital and cyber risk. So across the continent, there's still a lot of learning that needs to go on. And I think we can all benefit, as African nations from rubbing minds. In Ghana, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on they also have a strong regulator, but they don't have a regulation that has a gender or has a cybersecurity lens on boards yet. However, progressive organizations, progressive financial institutions have gone that way. So it's not always that we need to wait for the regulator to come with a stick and say this is a way to progress. I would encourage that a lot of organizations out there, financial and non-financial, do look to see how at the very highest levels, from a governance point of view, they can drive the management of risk so they can balance the adoption of IT, and they don't expose themselves unnecessarily to the risks of IT.
Yeah, and Nkem, one of the concerns is always, how much regulation will end up stifling innovation. And as part of the research for this, I came across this Gartner's top trends, and it talks about this agentic AI, which is AI that can even act autonomously. And there were all sorts of red flags in my head. So I'm thinking, we're just only starting on a journey towards regulation, and now we're introducing technologies that really push the boundaries. And so how can regulation even adapt fast? And what can organizations even do from the perspective of ethics? Where ethics come, where do you draw the line, and what does that decision-making look like?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really good question, and I think a lot of boards and IT committees are actually discussing this, right? How much do we bring AI in? How much do we trust the agents? How much do we trust the designs of those systems? And I think you have to have a very strong ethical framework at the core of your business, not just at the core of your technology, but at the core of your business. How do you make decisions? How transparent are your processes? And then also taking the time to actually analyze the systems that you currently have to see if those systems already have bias inbuilt. If those systems already have bias inbuilt, then once you transfer those systems to AI, that bias just gets amplified and perpetuated, right? So making sure that you have that. Also figuring out, I think, from a policy and governance perspective, regulators also need to look at what are the transparency and data laws that are going to be put in place to guide this? What are the laws in terms of documenting your AI and ensuring that you also have manual checks of, okay, this is what the agent actually did. Is this following the right process, and making sure that you are compliant in those things. So the regulator has a lot of work to do. And I think we also have to look at it not just from a Nigerian perspective, but really from a Pan-African and global perspective, and really look at what are those cross-border regulations and collaborations that have to happen as well in order to make sure that we all sort of stay safe. I think globally still this is a learning curve for everyone, right? Agentic AI was just launched a couple of, pretty much in this year, the big models, sort of have come out and have shown how powerful they can be and how autonomous they can actually operate, right? And I think that there's a lot of learning, so we have to make sure that we're staying on top of the trends, staying on top of also case studies and use cases of what can happen when your agent goes rogue, and making sure
that's a possibility.
Yes, it is, right? So I think from a risk perspective, you have to just really go very, very sci-fi movie and really just think about scenarios that could happen where the agent maybe takes over your entire organization.
Yeah. And speaking of the global environment, one of the things I've also observed is when you hear about big cybersecurity threats, now they're more commingled with political and geopolitical tensions and conflict, especially when you hear Russia, America, China. And somehow I always feel like Africa is sort of playing catch up. Because when it doesn't seem like we're thinking about the threats from a geopolitical perspective. If someone should attack the National Defense Agency today, I'm not talking about a small bank's platform. Are we really prepared for that level of cybersecurity threat?
To be honest, it's difficult to be completely prepared, but there is some thought that is going into it. I'm aware of that. There are agencies in government that are not sleeping because they're looking at that. They've termed certain institutions critical national infrastructure, and they've tried to ring fence them with a much higher level of vigilance and controls, But the truth is, for those organizations as well as for all of us, it's really just about making sure we're strengthening what I would call our cyber hygiene practices, So ensuring that as much as possible, we can automate our value chain so that we can build in controls. And it's not just up to people, what people know and what people don't know, especially because we've got such a skills crisis today. There's also a place for the processes, making sure that you're putting in controls into your processes. An easy, pragmatic way to do that is just to adopt global best practice standards. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if you're a fintech, for example, you want to make sure that you're compliant to the payment card industry data security standard, or if you're in any other sector, you want to be adopting some of the ISO standards. It just helps you comply and helps you imbibe a culture, because that's what we really need, a culture of information security. It needs to be sort of driven into the DNA of organizations. It needs to be the way that we do business around here. We cannot succeed by trying to bolt security onto existing processes that are already ridden with gaps and lapses, you know. So that is what those kind of frameworks and standards help organizations do. And then, of course, there's a place for people.
Right.
You know, the training, the education, the awareness needs to be ongoing. It needs to be relentless. It needs to be interesting. It needs to bear results.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we often say that people are the weakest link, and they are. And never more so than now in
Absolutely,
Nigeria.
and I agree. And the reason I agree, actually, I was just thinking about what happened in the US recently with where classified, apparently, information was made accessible to a journalist just by the fact that somebody added him to a WhatsApp group. And I'm thinking that is a human agency. That's actually human error. Technology had nothing to do with that, right?
Yeah. And that's where, you know, you want to ensure that you're educating people and you're making them aware, because ignorance is probably the biggest space for you know, cyber breaches.
Absolutely.
So it's ignorance, is malice, is mischief. But if you can minimize ignorance as much as possible, then, you know, you're scoring a good
Absolutely. And, you know, we talk about the big global cybersecurity threats, but I'm also now concerned about SMEs and small businesses also building trust with the consumers, because as an SME, you probably have less capacity to absorb a major issue. You could literally go down and that's the end of the business. So you actually have to take it almost more seriously than a big, large organization would. So how can SMEs leveraging these technologies actually build trust with end users?
So I think there are two sides to it. There's the technical side, right, which goes to what Ms. Odunfa was talking about imbibing standards, implementing those standards, and making sure that you're compliant to the best of your abilities, right? I think the other thing is making sure that your consumers also have control of their data. That's something I spoke about earlier. And then ensuring that your AI models are transparent and fair and driven by ethical policies. And then obviously also, again, there's that training side, investing in digital literacy for not just your technical people, but also the people who do your actual customer service, right? Because they engage with the customers. And that's where the second side, which is the human side, comes in. And there it's all about communication. It's about making sure that you are true to your purpose and what your brand stands for, that you show integrity in not just what you say, but also how you do things, right? And making sure that when you have a breach, for example, you're able to own up to it, inform your customers, be proactive about that and the communication, and also make sure that the customers are educated around how to make sure to protect themselves from breaches, right? Because just like what you mentioned with the WhatsApp group, we know so many people who say, oh, my WhatsApp was hacked, this happened, that happened, right? Oh, I gave my PIN to somebody that called me from the bank. Yeah, it was not the bank, it was someone else. Now my money is gone. So the consumer also has a lot of responsibility for protecting their data and protecting their digital footprint. So, but I think the brands, on the other hand, have that responsibility to make sure that the consumer has the knowledge and the tools to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, just before we go, looking at both of you, I'm thinking in my head, we need more people like you in this space. And so just to wrap up the conversation, what are you doing perhaps, or what can we do to get more people with diverse backgrounds, not just women, right, to retain talent in this space? Because with the advent of technology, we will need to find more highly skilled professionals who can tackle and deal with this issue. So very briefly, I'll start with you, Ms. Odunfa, and I'll end with...
I think there's a lot that can be done. The first one, in my view, is organizations need to start to dislodge some of the structural barriers that they have in there. So there are preconceptions, for example, on gender. I mean, can females do this kind of hard work, hard, quote unquote? And there are also other structural barriers, like some organizations, for example, till today don't admit polytechnic graduates, for example.
That's interesting, here in Nigeria.
Yes, so, so they limit themselves.
So there's a sort of educational discrimination.
There is. And I think that a lot of those barriers need to be dislodged so that you can open yourself up to a much wider skill pool. And then again, there's ageism. People are thinking, these young tots, can they do this kind of work? Well, they can.
And the converse may be true, where they discriminate against older
people.
women.
So we need to be a lot more open, and we also need to begin to train on a mass level. Everybody needs to do what they can.
Okay.
What we have on our side is a lot of people, a huge youth population. We need to get them in and start to train them. And to your point about not just technical qualifications, you know, people with degrees, for example, in psychology, can be very effective in cybersecurity.
Absolutely,
You know,
I
so
can
it's
imagine
about
that,
being
yeah.
more open and being more willing to try new things.
And be more inclusive. And Kem, what about you very briefly?
Yeah, so I think in addition to what Mrs. Odunfa has said, it's also for organizations to figure out how do you create internships, right? So the training is great, but where are they going to get the experience that they really need? And it's not enough to have just 1 or 2 spots. You have to do this, especially for
En
the big
masse,
organizations,
yeah.
you need to do this en masse, right? And then making sure that you also, especially for women, have programs that make sure they stay in the organization. Because what we see is that at entry level, you have a lot of girls that have studied computer science and that go into the organizations. By the time you get to mid-level management, they're gone.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, where did they go? And you know, now they're doing maybe some freelance work or selling clothes and doing something completely different, right? And there's something there that needs to be fixed to make sure that that pipeline actually flows all the way up.
Yeah, fantastic. Anyway, I have to say you're fantastic role models in this space. You know, I always, I cherish talking to women who are really doing hard things. Thank you for all the work you do in the industry. Great conversation. I've been speaking to Nkem Uwaje-Begho, CEO of FutureSoft, and of course, Mrs. Adedoyin Odunfa, founder and CEO of Digital Jewels. Well, that's all we have time for on Business Week. I'm Rolake Akikugbe-Feline. Of course, let's continue the conversation on X. Do have a lovely rest of the weekend.